Thank you, Jessica, not only for the introduction to my introduction, but also for your introductory presentation. And it actually very nicely covered the topic to the extent that I will have to skip some of my slides. But it's always a pleasure to have it presented by someone who actually is doing it and is a living example of how things can work, rather than a bureaucrat like me preaching a theoretical concept. But with that short provision, good afternoon, and it's a pleasure to be here in Portorož and be able to present to you a few more slides on demand response. Not only after a very nice presentation from or introduction from Jessica, but also after a series of interesting discussions this afternoon, where demand response indeed was mentioned in several of them. Specifically in the one on capacity mechanisms, practically all the panelists actually alluded to demand response and saw it as one of the possible measures to address capacity generation adequacy in the European context. We did so as well. We fully share that view, and it was certainly encouraging to find myself in a room filled with like-minded souls, if you want. The room is no longer fully filled, but we are still hopefully with like-minded souls here. Usually, when we come and present demand response, we come against a different perception of demand response. Where people are aware of demand response, and indeed it's not an unknown concept, but it is very often feared concept. So when people are actually referring to demand response, it's sometimes in the context of scary stories like demand response means that a big brother takes over your fridge, which actually is not a made-up title. It really appeared in the press in one of the member states. Or all kinds of negative stories about how it's not possible, how it cannot happen, etc. Well, we challenge that view, and we believe that demand response is possible and can be done in a way that empowers and benefits the consumer rather than bothers him or her, but also in a way which actually contributes to further stability in the energy system. Now, just really as a obligatory formality, I want to stress that we consider demand response different from energy efficiency. And as Jessica explained, indeed, the most advanced provisions in European legislation are made in the Energy Efficiency Directive, but that does not mean that we actually equate the two or confuse the two. For us, it's a different measure, it's a different concept, and I hope you would share that view with me. Efficiency is about doing the same stuff with less energy, and less energy is the focus of energy efficiency. Demand response is not so much concerned about consuming less energy, but more about consuming it in the right moment and in the right way, so that actually it is more conducive to stability in the system. Which does not pit the two against each other. It still makes it perfectly possible for demand response to sit within a general energy efficiency legislation, but it's important to recognize that the two are different. They are not different in the sense that they both actually bring potential tangible benefits to the consumer. Efficiency lowers your bill because you use less electrons. Demand response can also lower your bill because you use electrons at times when they are cheaper. And it is indeed the fundamental benefit of demand response as we see it, although, as we heard from Jessica, it's not the only one that can actually drive demand response into market. But I think it is very important for us to actually stress that particular consumer benefit aspect of demand response. So from studies that have been done, or pilot projects where demand response has been already practiced in various regions, including Europe, but also outside of Europe, in Australia, in the US, we have seen household bills reduced by 10 or even more % of the energy cost. For industrial clients, this is even higher. These are significant savings. If you think that you can shave off your energy bill by 10, 15, even more %, that obviously is not something that you should neglect. There are sort of energy efficiency effects from demand response examples, or sort of energy efficiency effects from practical demand response examples have also been observed, but they are relatively minor. So when you actually run a system of demand response in the pilots that we have been made aware of, also thanks to the work of Jessica's association, we see that the absolute volume of energy consumed by consumers lowers only a bit, 2 to 4%. But it's actually the bill that actually comes down much more significantly. There is possibility for further reduction in the bill, in the sense that the demand response, the shift in consumption in time, not only brings you to periods of lower price of energy, but it also lowers the charge on the system. As Jessica was mentioning, it lowers the amount of generation capacity that has to be present in the system. It puts less strain on the infrastructure, transmission and distribution infrastructure. It requires less infrastructure and distribution profile, so less investment in copper, etc. And all that should also translate to savings for consumers. But those are not direct savings, obviously. Those are savings which primarily accrue to the cost on which transmission and transmission and distribution systems are run. And those cost savings should hopefully, given that these are regulated entities, be passed on to the consumer. But obviously, you need for that a well-functioning methodology, well-functioning regulatory authority, etc. So we put those lower system costs in parentheses because they are not automatic. But hopefully, in Slovenia, this is the best place to say it. Hopefully we have efficient regulators in all member states, because in Slovenia we do have actually the agency of regulators sitting in Ljubljana. So if they are not efficient, you know where to go, and it's not far away from here. So I already mentioned, so these are the benefits that accrue directly to the consumer in the form of a reduced bill for energy. And here the consumer can be either a household or an industrial consumer. There are wider benefits in the sense of system efficiency, because if you don't need to construct so much peak generation capacity, which is exactly the generation capacity that sits idle most of the time in the year and is used only several hours a month, or some of them even several hours a year only. If you don't have to build those peak, or at least not so many of those peak power plants, you obviously improve the overall efficiency of the use of the fleet, of the generation fleet present, and that clearly increases the efficiency of the system. And you need less grid, as I mentioned earlier. And finally, the third group of benefits, as we see it, are benefits that you could call side benefits or vicarious benefits, not because they are negligible or unimportant. They are not perhaps in the core of why you do demand response, but they are nevertheless quite useful and important. First of all, as you flexibilize demand and make it possible for demand to follow better the fluctuation in supply, you obviously respond to the changing trend in generation with the growing proportion of renewables. The fluctuation in the generation, the unpredictability of that fluctuation comes more and more as you introduce more and more renewables. If you can actually make demand flexible and following that development in the supply, you obviously then make it possible for more and more renewables to be integrated in the system. And that is good for the greenhouse gas emissions, that is good for environment in general. So these are sort of additional benefits that you obtain from demand response. Last but not least, the very last bullet point is very important for us. It's the fact that if you make demand response of this sort possible, it means that you actually engaged consumers. Consumers started to care about how he or she consumes, how he can actually better manage his consumption profile, how he can actually modulate his consumption habits so that they better correspond to what is available on the market. And that has a very important effect in times when we are talking about bringing consumer to the market, creating an energy system which not only revolves around the consumer, but which also integrates the consumer as its active part. If you here give him a tool to actually become active and be rewarded by his activity, that is a wonderful way of actually encouraging further consumer engagement, and it's the empowerment in the true sense of that word. Now, what do you need for such system of demand response? For a system of demand response that functions in that way, it's a lot more than two things. It takes two to tango. It takes a lot more to do demand response. You need smart appliances, first and foremost. You need appliances that are actually able to change their consumption in time without necessarily creating any discomfort for the consumer. And here we are not talking the often badly quoted example of washing machine or dishwasher, who runs at times when the energy is cheaper, because that is not necessarily bringing the same comfort to the consumer. If you cannot switch on your washing machine when you need your dry and clean linen, if you have to switch it on when it's actually convenient, that's a big discomfort. But there are other appliances which are much more suited, much better suited to actually be engaged in demand response, especially appliances which have something to do with heat or the absence of heat, i.e. cooling. These are the freezers, the fridges, the cooling systems, the heating systems of the house, the hot water provision in the buildings. These are appliances which can actually modulate their consumption in time much more easily, and certainly without the consumer feeling any discomfort. So you need those appliances, but you also need them reacting to the situation in the wholesale market. So you need a wholesale market which appropriately prices electricity over time. So at times when the electricity is abundant, the price has to be low. At times when the electricity is scarce compared to demand, the prices have to be high. So suitably flexible wholesale market, but you also need a retail market at the bottom, which is able to translate those wholesale signals to the individual contracts with consumers. It's no use if you have a nicely time-varying wholesale markets and then consumers are stuck, all of them, with one flat tariff, let alone one that is actually regulated by a bureaucrat somewhere in the capital. That certainly does nothing for demand response. You need to have the possibility for retail prices to actually, in certain contracts, not necessarily in all contracts, but you need to have a possibility to have contracts which will actually mirror the developments in the wholesale market. And in the middle of that, you also need an important enabler, and that's a meter that actually is able to measure the consumption of the consumer in sufficiently short time intervals. This applies, this is already the case for large industrial clients, as you know, but with new technologies, it's possible to have a similar frequently measuring meter also for small consumers, for small companies, but even for households. We call this smart meter in the sense that it's a meter which is equipped with IT items or IT elements which allow it to actually register consumption in up to 15-minute intervals. But 1 hour is good enough if your contract is actually able to distinguish price by 1 hour periods. That's enough if your meter can actually register that. But the meters that we know these days, the mechanical meters that most of us have in the house, they cannot do that. They register at best what you consume during the day and what you consume during the night, and at the end of the year someone comes and reads it, or if you are trusted by your company, you can actually report these two numbers by phone. Well, that's not smart meter. So it's a system which actually brings in all these elements together that we need to build in order to have demand response happening. Is this a dream? Is this a pie in the sky? We believe not. And as Jessica presented, it's already a reality in some member states, unfortunately not many. But there are countries, there are examples where indeed the consumer-driven demand response, which is based on signals from the market, is actually happening and brings down energy bills and increases grid stability. Unfortunately, so far as we know, it's only possible in those few member states for industrial clients, more or less. So the challenge is, how do we bring more of this demand response possibility in more member states, and how do we actually decline that, or how do we actually spin that off so that it's available also for households? And with new technologies, it's all possible. Technologies are becoming more and more cheap. They are more and more advanced. So it's not a question of not having the right kit. It's really only about the mindset of the regulators, of the business providers, ultimately of the consumers as well. And it's also about the regulatory framework. And therefore, we have come out earlier in this month with a policy paper on demand response. It was presented in the part of a broader package that was addressing generation adequacy and the flexibility of the energy system. Those of you who follow the shenanigans of Brussels decision-making more closely, you will know that this was for a while referred to as the July package, because it was prepared for adoption in July. Then I think some complexities of the matter. It is a package of 5 or 6 policy documents, so it's not easy to really balance all that and juggle it all together, 5-dimensional space. I think even Stephen Hawking's moves in 4-dimensional. We had to move in 5-dimensional. So it didn't come out in July. So for a while it was then called the summer package, then the summer ended, so it was called the Indian summer package, then it was called the autumn package, then it was called the next week package. Well, finally it's out. It was out 2 weeks ago, so it's out there. And there is a paper on demand response in which we list the 3 areas of action which we believe are necessary in order to enable demand response of the sort that I was describing and that Jessica already introduced in the beginning in Europe. First of all, it's important to create a system of market-based and transparent incentives. System which will include dynamic pricing, that will include reward structures so that demand response undertaken by customers is not unrewarded. And I will not go again over the link between the retail and wholesale, etc., but I think I described what I mean. But it's also very important that the system of incentives includes data protection and privacy measures. It's clear that if you are talking about meters that measure your consumption every hour and somehow put it together in a register and then at some point remit it to someone who provides some services and then you get the bill, etc., and then your household is connected in real time to some information from wholesale market, etc., you not only have a lot of IT involved, but you also have a lot of data exchanges involved. And because it's data on private consumption or private behavior of individuals, it is private data and therefore can call in all questions about privacy and intrusion of privacy, etc. People will not trust demand response services if they are not assured that the data exchanges this involves are actually secure and they will not end up in the wrong hands and they will not be used against them. So the incentive part absolutely needs to include that point. The second area of action is about opening the market to demand response. And there I would refer to what Jessica said already earlier, that you can see at the moment that in most of the member states, demand response is not on equal footing, even though it's able to actually give the same amount of generation capacity effectively to the system as a power plant can by federating demand that can actually disappear and therefore can effectively lower the need for generation. So it functions as a negative power plant if you want, even though it can have the same contribution to balancing the system as a power plant, just with a minus sign. It is not currently recognized as the same resource in the rules and the specifications of the energy system. The prime example is that for balancing markets or for some of these arrangements, you need to bid in with some minimum amount of energy, and this minimum amount is often set at levels where you would really need to federate a lot of singular demand points in order to be able to bid. If it's set at 25 megawatt, that suits well most of the power plants, but it practically puts out of the market anyone who is not a large, very large industrial user and very heavy energy user. So the equal footing is not only about declaring it, as is the case in legislation already, but it's also about removing the practical obstacles of this sort from the rules and codes. And then finally, it's all about technologies. As I said, technologies are not the missing part. They are available, but they are not present in the market. They are available on the drawing boards and perhaps even in the prototypes or small runs in appliance producers or equipment producers, but they are not there out. They are not out there in the supermarkets. The smart appliances, the fridges and the cooling systems that are able to actually link directly to the market and react, they are not out there. You cannot buy them like you can buy a normal fridge. And the same for smart meters. They are not out there yet in sufficient numbers. So rolling out those appliances and those technologies is equally important. All these actions that I have outlined, the 3 areas, we want to define further the individual action points that need to come under the umbrella of each of the action areas. But we overall see those actions as linked together in a common logic of a smart grid. And there is a general concept of smart grid which is promoted by the European Commission, and we work with member states to actually keep smartening up the grids, both local grids and the high voltage grids across Europe in the EU. And demand response is definitely needs to be undertaken. The steps towards demand response need to be undertaken in the context of those policies for the promotion of smart grids. I'll skip perhaps that slide because it's just yet another way of looking at the actions that need to take place. And I will stop at this slide, last one. If we say that we want to take these actions in promoting demand response under the larger umbrella of our smart grids policies, then obviously smart meters are a keystone of that policy, and they are also the key enabler of demand response, as I explained in a minute. In that regard, it's very important that we have prepared an overview of the plans that member states have with respect to smart meters. We have made those comparisons both for electricity and for gas. For electricity, the results are actually quite encouraging. The cost-benefit analysis that we have collected by now from all member states show that about 2/3 of member states have conducted cost-benefit analysis and are somehow planning rollout between now and 2020. And the rollout should result in at least 75% of all EU consumers, so not only in those who are rolling out, but if you calculate those consumers that should end up with smart meters in the member states who are going ahead with the rollout, and you divide that over the whole population of all consumers in the EU, you end up with a 75% penetration of smart meters planned for 2020 by member states. So it's not a Commission Brussels plan. These are national plans reported by national authorities between now and 2020. That's not a bad number. 75% is quite good. It's a substantial investment. It helps, obviously, economy, generates demand and jobs, etc. But it's also quite a good result which gets us fairly high up against the hurdle of minimum rollout that would be needed for really getting the scale of demand response enablers, etc. So it's only a plan, or it's only 28 plans, or 27. Croatia has not reported yet. So it's 27 plans. We need to make sure that they are actually not only committed to but delivered. But if everything goes more or less to plan, it does not look so discouraging for demand response enablers or technical backups or technical facilitators in Europe between now and 10 or 15 years from now. The regulatory framework is a different issue. I have spoken about that a minute ago, and you have seen from Jessica how much work they are doing at European level, and I'm sure gentlemen will say more about how it actually in reality works in Slovenia or in some other markets, what kind of hurdles they come up to and they have to deal with. There's one more slide on smart appliances. There is also action not only on smart meters but also on smart appliances. We are working through standardization, through eco-design measures to make sure that appliances in the future do include the features that will make them open to demand response programs and demand response solutions, and that these functionalities will be there open to consumers, not forced onto them, but actually offered to them as an opportunity, so that the demand response is not only rewarded, but is also still fully at the discretion of the consumer. And with that, thank you for your attention.